Hi everybody, and welcome to week 2. This week we focus on individual learner differences. Those are the individual traits that every learner has and how they affect one's ability to learn a second language. I have to say that of all of the traits that have been studied over the entire history of second language acquisition research, none has been studied more than the effects of age. This is really, there's great evidence for this just in the sheer number of studies that have been done. But just to let you know, in our textbook this week, age gets its own separate chapter. That should tell you how important Dr. Ellis feels that this particular feature is. And in the first edition of the book, individual learner differences were all clumped together, and age was dealt with as one of those factors, but now it is standing on its own. And partly this is due to a feeling, a commonly held belief, that children are much better language learners than adults. This is based on what is known as the critical period hypothesis. So we have long known that language is biologically determined, but not ethnically determined. That means that any young child can acquire any human language as their native language. A child born in Guatemala but taken to Beijing will become a native Mandarin speaker, and a child born in Tokyo but raised in Milan will become a fluent native Italian speaker. At the same time, children can learn 2 or more languages early on with relative ease because there are things that will confuse them about it. But adults cannot do this as easily. Adults have much more difficulty learning a second language. Penfield and Roberts theorized that there is what they felt was a critical period for language acquisition, but they believe the window of opportunity closes at puberty. Now, over the years, 2 different versions of this theory have emerged, a strong version and a weak version. We'll be looking at both of those a little bit later. The critical period hypothesis actually has its roots in what we know about neurobiology. We know that there are periods of synaptic growth when the brain is making huge numbers of new connections and kind of going and growing in all directions. It's not that there are more brain cells, but they are becoming more connected. And that these periods of growth are followed by periods of culling, where those connections that are not used much are cut, or they are dissolved. That areas of the brain that are not being used are reassigned to other purposes. And there is a significant decrease in learning during those periods of synaptic culling. I would also point out that they tend to be accompanied by very stormy emotional periods, because the synaptic culling usually takes place at around the age of 2 or 3, the terrible 2s, and it happens again at adolescence. And we all know that adolescence is not the easiest time emotionally. But these are also windows of opportunity which present optimum periods for specific areas of learning and development. And there are some that are really biologically set. An example of this is sensory development. We know from research that was done in the 1960s that kittens need to have balanced visual stimulation. Both eyes have to be allowed to focus during specific critical periods, or they don't develop normal vision. That's also true with monkeys, and that also seems to be true with human beings. It's a universal issue with mammals, certainly with mammals. We don't know about other species, but it does seem to apply to humans as well as others. And in fact, the sensory systems, in order to develop normally, they need to have normal experiences, normal stimulation. That abnormal experiences tend to lead to abnormal development, and a lack of experience tends to shut the development down entirely. After the child passes through that sensitive period, experience does not lead to an increase in neural connections, and those connections that are there, or the lack thereof, that becomes a permanent state for the child. In sensory systems, the effect of experience becomes increasingly irreversible as the child ages. And we know that as those synaptic densities are culled, as the number of them falls, those windows of opportunity close. The same is true with the window for social attachment. We know that a child who is not held in infancy, not given proper, warmth and cuddling and caring, tends to develop attachment disorders that you cannot cure later in life. The question is, does this process hold true for language acquisition? Is there actually a window of opportunity for this, and is there a critical period from which you can't really recover? Early support for this theory came, surprisingly, not from language, but from neurology and the findings of Dr. Eric Lenberg. Lenberg held that, or he found that damage to the right cerebral hemisphere in children led to language loss, but that did not happen with adults. Adults could have right hemisphere damage and it had no effect on them. But for adults, surgery in the left cerebral hemisphere resulted in language loss, and that didn't happen so much with children. In fact, there are children that were born with only one cerebral hemisphere, only the right hemisphere, and they were able to develop relatively normal language skills. So Lenberg concluded that there is a biological basis for language and that it is different in children than it is in adults. In other words, children employ both hemispheres. Adults, it tends to be centered in the left hemisphere. And for that reason, he felt that there was not only a biological basis, but that age played a very significant role. Other support for the critical period hypothesis came from the feral children. These are children who were raised without much human contact or with no human contact, wild children who were not exposed to their first language until after age 6 or 7. And it was found that they do not attain full mastery of the language, even if they're exposed when they're 6 or 7. Deaf children also show a linear decline in mastering their first language as they get older. The younger a child learns sign language, a deaf child learns American Sign Language, the more adept they become at it, the more fluent they are with it. So it's clear that there are windows of opportunity and critical periods for first language acquisition. If there is a critical period for second language learning, it would support Chomsky's theories about first language acquisition that involve the universal grammar and the acquisition device. It would explain why children can learn any language, but adults struggle after they reach adulthood. The strong version of the critical period hypothesis supports this, and it holds that up to puberty, anyone can acquire a second language naturally and can achieve native or near native proficiency. But after the critical period ends, that natural route is blocked. The weak version of this theory is a little bit different. It says after the critical period, the ease of second language acquisition begins to decline. It becomes more difficult for the learner to attain native-like or near native-like proficiency. The most commonly quoted study on this is Johnson and Newport, and their work supports the strong version. They dealt with 46 native Chinese and Korean speakers, half of whom learned English after the age of 15 and half of whom learned English before the age of 15, and there were clear, statistically significant differences in proficiency, with the younger learners way surpassing the older ones. Other studies have concurred, but Birdsong's 1992 study found really different results. He did not find that there was a critical period. We also know that there are just tons and tons of exceptions to the rule when it comes to adults who can reach native-like fluency. My mother-in-law, Aleha HaShalom, is a great example of this. She spoke English like a native speaker. It sounded to me like she had grown up in the Bronx. Her accent was pure American New York. But she didn't come to the U.S. until 1941, just before her 17th birthday. And she came speaking no English. Now, she had had the benefit of having a French governess as a child who spoke only French to her, and so her French was perfect. She spoke French like a Parisian, even though German was her first language. Her ability to speak French is really what saved her during the Holocaust. But coming to the States, she and her grandmother were waiting for a ship in Lisbon, Portugal. That was where the ship was. That was where they had passage. They had their papers. They were all set to go, but they had to wait for a few weeks for the ship to arrive in Lisbon. And during that time, she picked up enough Portuguese to be able to negotiate her way through buying food and getting them a place to stay and making sure that all of their needs were attended to. And she had, of course, had no experience with Portuguese. She just picked it up. So she was clearly a very gifted language learner, but she is not the only exception that there is. There is a documented case of a woman named Julie who attained near native proficiency in Arabic. That is really quite a remarkable feat because Arabic is a really tough language for native English speakers. On the flip side, Patty, who had spent equally as much time as Julie learning English, even though her native language was Chinese, she had she had been living in the States and learning English for 20 years, but she was still making mistakes. She did not have full mastery of the language. There is also conflicting evidence about how near native early adolescents become. We have recordings of post-adolescent French language speakers, French language learners, and native French speakers found that their language was absolutely native. So that has happened, but another study, equally important, done 10 years later, found that there was no native-like proficiency for late starters. So the results on all these studies are pretty mixed, and we don't really have a good hard and fast rule on it. What we do know is that there are different windows of opportunity for different skills. Phonology, which is pronunciation, grammar, and lexis, which is vocabulary. These are three areas that were studied by Granena and Long. in 2012, and they found that these items close at different times. For example, phonology, the ability to pronounce words like a native, that closes very early as the age of 4. And they found that vocabulary closes next, and that grammar closes in the mid-teens. I personally have questioned that order that they've come up with. I have found that the ability to learn new vocabulary doesn't close in our first language and doesn't close in our second language. I do think that grammar fossilizes, and I think that happens before the ability to learn new words. Research has also looked at different routes to learning a second language. We know that in the initial stages, adults way surpass children in every area except pronunciation. First language development, we know, follows a generally fixed order and fixed route of acquisition. L2 for children, in a natural setting especially, follows also a fixed order, but it's slightly different from the one followed in first language acquisition. And most of the studies suggest that adults also follow a generally fixed order, but there is a notion, there is some evidence that explicit instruction may alter that route a little bit. Still, I think it is reasonable to understand the natural route of second language learning and to sequence instruction in ways that conforms to it, or at least doesn't fly in the face of it and violate those principles. The issue of ultimate attainment is also interesting. Because adults have higher cognitive skills, much higher levels of cognitive functioning than children, they benefit from explicit instruction because they're able to apply those cognitive skills to second language tasks. So that's why adults can surpass children in the early stages. They're able to compensate by bringing their cognitive skills to the process. But child learners in naturalistic settings need a lot of time. That's true for first language acquisition, which takes about 7 years at least before a child is really becoming fully capable in his or her native language. And the same is true for second language exposure. It's a little bit faster, but it is a slow process. Still in all, children eventually surpass older learners in all areas and can achieve native-like proficiency. So if a child begins to learn a second language early, they ultimately will reach greater levels of proficiency. This is true in naturalistic settings. It is questionable about whether or not it's true in terms of a classroom kind of situation where a child gets limited exposure to the second language and limited opportunity to communicate in it. So, in conclusion, we can say that age matters a lot, but its effects are complex. It's not so simple as to just say that children are better language learners. They learn more easily and they attain higher levels of proficiency. They may ultimately attain higher levels of proficiency after many years, but they don't learn it more easily than adults do. In fact, in the early stages, adults have a much greater advantage in terms of grammar and vocabulary because they're able to bring their cognitive skills, their other cognitive skills, to the process. Children are not so able to do that. So we also know that there is no single critical period for second language learning. that there are several different critical or sensitive periods for different aspects of the language. For example, pronunciation is one of those windows that closes very early, pretty much by the age of 4 for most people. Grammar and vocabulary close later. Grammar for sure closes. Vocabulary, it's kind of an open question, and exactly when those aspects close are also open questions. So we don't really have a good firm answer on all of this just yet. We also know that first language acquisition follows a pretty fixed order. We know that child second language acquisition also follows a generally fixed order, but it's different from what you find in first language acquisition. There's some subtle differences. And adults, most of the research finds that adults also follow a predictable fixed order of acquisition, but some studies suggest that explicit instruction may alter that sequence. So adult second language may vary. Even so, I would argue that it's advisable to sequence instruction in ways that conform to the natural route, even when dealing with adult learners who may benefit from the explicit instruction. And so with all of this, we will turn for the rest of the week to the other effects of individual variables, and you will get a sense of why language learning is such a complex process.